In today's video, we're going to be building a all new quadcopter. Now, this is called the Eachine Tyro89 kit. Now, the number is very important because they've released many different kits, and this is the 89mm version. It's a 2.5-inch micro quadcopter, which in my opinion could be one of the best kits that Eachine have released so far. And why is that? Well, because of its overall, I don't want to say performance just yet. I'm sure the performance is going to be great, but the overall layout and how it's set up and even some of the things provided. For example, the ESC is a proper ESC for a 2.5-inch quadcopter, so you will be able to set up any other motor you want and have a great time if for some reason you didn't want to continue with these motors. Also, it's using a proper 20x20 flight controller and a proper camera. However, it has room, a lot of room for upgrades. For example, adding HD recording capabilities, because the canopy here is somewhat flexible. It's not very rigid, so it's gonna be a very fun and interesting build now. And later on, once we see how it flies, we might set this up with an HD camera such as the Runcam 3 Split Nano, which is an amazing camera in my opinion, one of the best inbuilt HD cameras out currently on the market right now, which I'll have as well linked down below, and everything here is linked down below. So what we're going to do today is we're going to build this step by step, also helping you understand everything and what everything means and what everything does, and some of the things that are going to be required in order for building, such as these hex driver toolkit, which I highly recommend you actually use a dedicated hex driver, such as these right here, which I've been using for about a year and a half. It's very important to use these, and the reason why it's important to use a dedicated hex driver is because sometimes the screws provided in specific packages or frames are very terrible, and if you strip them, you basically, sometimes you could ruin a whole quadcopter or a motor. So that's why we use proper hex drivers. So first step when approaching this build, what you want to do is you want to go ahead and set up the ESC. Now this is a 20 amp BLHeli S ESC, which overall has great filtration for such a small micro, which is something we look for if you don't know what that means. And it is a proper ESC, which is really great to see in such a kit at such a price. Usually a ESC of this nature would cost you half of what this kit actually costs. That's pretty crazy here. Now, as you can tell, some other features that I really like about this is it has either connectors or you could direct solder. So if you had motors that didn't come with connectors, you still have your pads right here you'll be able to solder to, which is something really great, which keeps it versatile, universal, and you can do a lot of things with it. As you can tell, I've gone the route with the connectors. So the first step we want to do here is we want to install the ESC into place. And you want to do that with the screws and the nylon standoffs here, and then close it off with the nuts. Now you're gonna be like, well, how the hell is the flight controller gonna fit? Well, be patient, because this thing actually goes into the canopy here, which we're gonna get into that step later on. But the first thing you want to do is you want to go ahead and secure the ESC into place. Next, you want to go ahead and grab your low ESR capacitor, and you'll find two holes at the battery terminals right there. You will find the minus sign, which is obviously the ground sign. And once you find the ground sign here on the ESC, you want to find the ground pin that's on the capacitor, which is the pin right next to this sign right here on the capacitor, which is going to be obviously that side right there. And the side that has nothing is usually the positive. It's always the positive. So that's going into the positive right there, just barely sticking out. And just have that sticking there because we're going to solder that first. And I also really like this feature that it was really thought through for someone adding a low ESR capacitor, because once you start soldering battery wires, and you also have to work with pins coming in from a capacitor, it could be a nightmare, especially if you're new. So this makes your life so much easier this way. All right, so I'll reseat this later. It just came out because obviously I haven't soldered it. Now, when we come down to the motors, you need to take something also into consideration. In the package, they come in two separate bags. 2 motors come in one bag and 2 motors come in another bag. Grab one of the bags with 2 motors and place them across each other. Now take a really nice look of how I have the frame laid out. You have the side with no holes. That would be the back side here, and this should be the front side, and your ESC should be placed exactly the same way I have it placed here. This is going to be the front, so make sure you take note of that. So what you do is once you get the bag, get the first bag and put them across from each other like this, and then the other bag, put them across from here, because the 2 motors in one bag spin exactly the same way, and the 2 motors in the other bag spin exactly the same way but opposite of the first bag. and we'll get into that later on. But as of right now, it doesn't matter. Just go ahead and install them, but just make sure they're across from each other. So if we find out that they're spinning the wrong direction, then we just flip-flop all of them. But as of right now, we really don't need to worry about the rotation. We could also change that in the software once we get into that step. So once you install the motors into place and plug in the connectors, now once this is set, we can actually move this to the side and begin with the flight controller. The flight controller is going to be a very simple setup. However, there is a couple things we need to solder, or should I say bridge, in order to have it work perfect. So now the flight controller is in charge of many things. It's in charge of receiving the input that's coming in from your controller. It's also in charge of giving the on-screen display information down to your goggles through the video transmitter. It is also in charge of controlling the electronic speed controller, which is this thing right here, which tells the motors what to do. It's also in charge of keeping the whole thing stable in the air. So the first thing we want to do on the flight controller is we need to find these 3 pads right there. And you need to take note of what kind of receiver you're using. Now, if you're using an FRSky or FreeSky S-Bus protocol, we're going to have to bridge these 2 together. That's very important, or you'll never get your receiver to work here. And if you're using FlySky like iBus or maybe even PPM, then you want to bridge the first 2 together right there and leave that last one. So only 2 should be bridged from these. So if you're using FlySky, you want to bridge these 2. And if you're using S-Bus, you're going to want to use these 2. So sorry again. iBus, these 2. S-Bus, these 2. FRSky is the bottom. FlySky is the top 2. So I'm going to hold my soldering iron right on the 2 pads and bring in the solder here. And just let them connect. Make sure they're connected. If you need to add more, but try not to bridge the 3rd one, which is very important. So right now I'm using obviously S-Bus, which is FRSky, so I bridged the bottom 2 here, and it's looking great. The 3rd one seems to not have bridged with them. So now we're basically ready with the flight controller, and all we have to do, because this is going to be such a simple build, is just basically connect the connectors. The only soldering left to do would be the capacitor, which is very important to add, by the way, and the XT30. So this connector here is going to be the connector in charge of having the flight controller speak to the electronic speed controller. And now it's going to go on the biggest connector right here. Now the connector below that is the camera connector, which is right here. Now we're not going to connect this just yet. We'll do that right before we insert the flight controller into the canopy, because this is currently not removable. So we'll put this to the side. The video transmitter as well, we're going to keep it for a bit later. Now the video transmitter will be connected on this connector right here, which is next to the camera, and it says VTX. It's very hard to see it, but it says VTX here. So we would connect that like this. Next, it's going to be the wire for the receiver, which is this one right here. Now we're going to have to cut this wire here and solder directly to our receiver. Now I highly recommend the XM Plus radio if you're using FRSky, and this will make our life so much easier. And that will just go right in there, and we'll cut that up in a bit here. So now we have the receiver wire is going to go here. However, we're going to remove it so we can go ahead and prepare our radio. So let's move this off to the side here. So the first thing I like to do is always twist the wires, because these are silicone, and it just keeps them very neat, and you'll be able to tuck them in a lot of different places. So I'm going to cut it right about here. Also, another side note here is what's really nice about silicone wires is you could actually pinch them and then pull up, and you basically have stripped them. So I'm going to go ahead and strip these, twist them, and add solder, and then we're going to go ahead and solder them directly to the receiver here. So now what I've done is I've twisted them first, added solder, and then trimmed them down to the required length, which is going to be like this. Now I'm going to go ahead and set up my XM Plus radio here. Now a small side note here, which might be useful to a lot of people, is if you're right-handed, it's better to start from the left side. So while you move along, you don't have the chance of hitting the other wires next to it. So I'm going to go ahead and just add a little bit of solder here, just to freshen these pads up a little bit. All right. And I'm soldering around 380 degrees Celsius. So if you didn't know, so this yellow wire is going to be the signal wire. That's what we can call it. Next wire is going to be 5 volt, especially for these XM Plus radios. So there we go. And the last wire is going to be ground. Now, you might tend to notice that ground wires are always harder to solder. That's because of the heat dissipation on the board. So just keep that in mind. Just be patient. And also always make sure your tip is shiny, because then the heat will transfer much easier. So now we have our receiver prepared. I'm going to go ahead and twist these wires just like this. It makes it really nice. And then we could bring in our flight controller and plug that right in. So like this, everything is connected to the flight controller. We have our video transmitter. We have our ESC part. We have our receiver. And the only thing that's left is our camera here, which we're going to do once we set this up inside the canopy. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to grab the frame with the ESC and begin soldering this thing. So the first thing we want to do is we want to reinsert the capacitor here. And again, this is the minus side. As you can tell, that's the ground, which is going to be the right side here right now, as you can tell. And that's going to go into the ground side right there. Now, it's better to put this on the bottom here and make sure these leads are short and there's no chance of the leads, these two, touching the carbon fiber, or else you will basically fry this immediately as soon as you plug in a battery, and then you just have a very bad day. So like this, I have the capacitor inserted, and the pins are sticking up, so I'm going to go ahead and add some solder. You don't want to push down on the pin. You want to kind of push it this way to hold it into place while you bring in your solder, and just let that go through. And again, the ground wires or the ground pad is going to need a bit more heat than the positive side, because the ground plane is just all over the board, and it just always needs that little bit of extra time here. Now, and again, I've managed to push out the pin here, so I'm going to go ahead and fix that real quick. So once the pads are ready and they have solder into place, next thing you want to do before you actually start soldering is you want to add a little bit of solder on them in order to help them just, you know, get on there much easier and much cleaner, because the solder they use, they just put really tiny amount out of the factory, out of the box here, and adding that extra solder on there or just freshen up that solder really does help the whole process, because usually in the build this is one of the most difficult parts to solder, you know, on big quadcopters as well as little quadcopters at times, but it's a bit easier with smaller quadcopters like this. And this is where you could see the most where usually most of the issues start to happen with a lot of people from bridging and stuff. So right here, if we take a look at it, we see that the minus is on the right side. However, again, since I'm right-handed, I'm going to start with the left side here, which is the positive. So a nice technique I like to use is I like to heat up the pad that I'm going to be soldering to first. Just preheat it basically, and then bring in the wire right on top, and then heat both the wire and the pad together. And just give it a little motion here, and that should start to fall into place. And you'll hear this really nice crunching sound, which hopefully will make it up to the microphone. Now that's getting really, really toasty right now, so it's very useful if you had some tweezers around. There we go. And that's looking really nice. And now we're going to do the same thing to the ground. And you'll also take note that the ground sometimes is a little bit more difficult to solder to, because it's all around the board, so it dissipates heat much, much better. Did I add solder to this? Yes, I think I did. Alright, so now we're going to go ahead and clean up the tip first. And we want to heat up the pad. Preheating the pad always does help dramatically. You got to be very, very careful with this. You see that? That's not something you want to do. There we go. You have to be very, very careful from solder splattering onto the main components on top of the ESC right there. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. All right, and that's actually looking pretty good. I'm satisfied with that currently. So like this, we're basically done here. So the next thing we need to do is we need to go ahead and grab our flight controller and our canopy. So now this is a very important step. You need to find this arrow right there, and it's pointing this way. So it's saying that this is the front here. So put your thumb right on that, and then this would be the back side right here. Bring in the canopy where the camera is facing the front here, and that would actually be installed in your quadcopter like this, or in your canopy like this. However, before installing that, let's go ahead and install our camera, which is going to be installed right here on this 3-pin connector, which is next to the ESC part right there. And again, follow the arrow, which is pointing that way. So this is the front here. And again, I'll put my thumb right on the front so I don't lose orientation. And I'm going to bring in my video transmitter here with its antenna. Be very careful. Try not to move this antenna too much, because sometimes they can break. And I'm just going to bring in my transmitter right through. This is our video transmitter that's going to be broadcasting the image down. And just double checking that my thumb is right on the front part, which is correct currently. All right, so this is going to be the front here. So I've routed both receiver and the video transmitter through the back here. So another nice way to know if you did this correctly, this USB part should be on the opening of the canopy right there. Then you also have done this correctly. And you should see this really long chip right here. This is the on-screen display. This should be on the bottom. It should not be up. So keep that in mind, which is also a very important thing to take note of here. All right, so once everything is connected inside, we do have 3 holes here that we can go ahead and screw the flight controller to, and everything is provided in the packaging here, which is really great. As you can tell, this is almost everything here. So you don't want the short screws, you actually want the slightly longer screws here to go into that. And you're gonna need the 1.5mm hex driver like I showed you, because all these screws are 1.5mm, and that should do the job for the whole thing. And again, be careful when you're installing the screws here. Don't over tighten them, because it'll strip the plastic inside. And then basically you'll need to probably purchase a new canopy. So try not to over tighten it, but also try not to keep the flight controller flopping around, or else yeah, you'll just have vibrations that you won't be able to tune out, or you'll probably end up needing to put some sort of a rubber O-ring between the flight controller and the canopy, or something like that, or maybe using slightly longer screws. The alignment isn't perfect, but it's working. It's great because it's adding a little bit of extra tension on the plastic piece, which is allowing the screws to hold in. And like this right now, we're basically almost done. We'll have to figure something out for these 2 guys. Should probably 3D print something later on. And this connector is going to connect right here. It's the only connector that's hanging down that I forgot to mention. Should hang down, because that's going to be for the ESC. I will wrap it around itself just a little bit, just to make it a little bit cleaner and to tuck it in a bit nicer. Okay, so that's in right now. And next thing we need to do is we need to set up the screws here. Now if we bring this over, we'll find that we have 3 long screws in the package, and there they are. And we'll also find these little rubber thingies, just a bunch of them. We're gonna need 3 of them right now, I think. Yeah, there's a slight modification that I just made right now off camera, which is if you just use one of these, it's not sufficient enough, and the 2 stacks might touch each other, short circuit, and you can say bye-bye to everything. So what I've done is, instead of using one full one, I did use a full one plus a half of one. So it was 1.5 of these, 1.5 and 1.5, and you can cut these in half really easily, and you still have plenty enough. As you can tell right here, I still have plenty there, and they give you a ton of extra hardware in there, which is really nice. Now as you can tell, I've gone ahead and used double-sided tape to hold the video transmitter into place, and I've done it in this position in order to keep the antenna out of the way, because later on we can grab a zip tie to go around the antenna through one of these holes and to keep it into place so we don't have it get chopped off by the propellers, which is going to be something you want to take into consideration here. Next we have our receiver here. It's a good thing that this is a pretty small receiver, but we actually need a smaller one. However, I think I found a way to get this in a pretty decent position. So right now I'm going to cut some heat shrink, and if you don't know where to buy heat shrink, I'll link down below also the pack that I've bought in. I usually buy 1 pack every year, and it lasts me actually more than a year, so they're very useful. They have all the sizes and everything you need, which is really great here. So this might be a bit too long for it, yeah, so that's what she said. So I'm going to trim this down slightly here. All right, so once we've added heat shrink to the receiver, so I'm just going to tuck that right there. Later on I'll find some zip ties or something to figure out a way to mount this. We're also going to have to take note of the wire here, so I'm going to go ahead and twist it, and I'll show you the best way to route antennas, or not the best way, I'll just say my way, because there's plenty of ways to route these antennas. So like this, as you can tell, it kind of tucked itself really nicely to the frame, and we have a less chance of having a prop strike on the receiver part here. So the next thing I'd want to do here is I want to bring 2 zip ties, and I will set them up under the motor wires here and make sure they stick out from the bottom. So the next thing we want to do for the antennas, we want to set up 2 zip ties like this across away from each other. As you can tell, it's coming in from the bottom side here, or it's looping in through from the bottom side, and it's not touching the motor wires. Very important, because you don't want these to pinch the motor wires. These zip ties are right under the motor wires here. Next thing we want to grab is some heat shrink. So here's some black heat shrink, and what I'm going to do with the heat shrink is I'm going to just install it on the zip tie and have the receiver's antenna be routed through, and this should act as a support. And let's go ahead and set this up. We might need a couple because these antennas are slightly longer than usual. So, or I mean, they're just long. So once it's complete, it should look something like this. However, I still don't like the video transmitter, how it's mounted. I'll figure something out for that later on. I'll probably 3D design something for it in TPU, print it out, and have it set up here once we're going to take it out flying. Currently it's snowing, so this is not going to get some air until a couple days. Now for the antenna part, as you can tell, this is what I've done, which is 2 zip ties, one that way, one the other way, and I've routed the antennas through under the heat shrink on the zip ties, and this stays below the propellers here, as you can tell. So when the propellers are moving, these are actually pushed down, and there's no way for these to come back up and get striked. And yeah, as you can tell, it's really nice. It has a really nice bounce back effect that comes straight back down. And overall, this looks like a pretty neat setup. I don't know how it's going to fly. I'm going to check other people's videos on it today if anybody actually has created one or built one. And then we'll be taking this guy out soon. I've been flying a bunch of them lately, so we're going to see how well this actually stacks up with everything else. So I really do like the design. I like how they've suspended the flight controller, but I do hope this canopy also acts as a dampener and not something to allow vibrations to go into the gyro, thus creating some really nasty vibrations. So we're gonna have to see how well that's gonna stack up. But overall, I like the idea. It's probably one of their best micro kits they've released. They're getting there, but they're getting there slowly. But I like this one. It's, you know, I don't like the placement of the video transmitter, but we're gonna see how well this stacks up. This is a good video transmitter, by the way, so it's gonna be fine in that perspective. So wait for part 2 where I go through the beta flight and we do the flight footage. And I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. Everything is linked down below, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace out, guys.